The prairie wind whistled through the empty train station, carrying away Eleanor Devereux's desperate pleas as the last car of the Great Western disappeared down the tracks, taking with it her hopes, her luggage, and the last of her money. Tears stung her eyes as the reality of her situation sank in. Stranded in Willow Creek, Arizona Territory, 1876, with nothing but the clothes on her back and not even enough coins for a ticket to the next town. Eleanor stood frozen on the wooden platform, her ivory dress already gathering dust from the unforgiving desert air. The station master had already locked up for the day, leaving her truly alone as the sun began its descent toward the rugged mountains in the distance. She had come west to start anew after her father's death left her with nothing but debts and broken promises in Boston, and now even this desperate gamble seemed to be crumbling before her eyes. "Quite a predicament you've found yourself in, miss," came a deep voice from behind her. Eleanor turned sharply, startled by the sudden intrusion into her misery. Before her stood a tall man with broad shoulders and sun-weathered skin. His dark brown Stetson cast a shadow over piercing blue eyes that studied her with unexpected gentleness. A trail-worn duster hung from his frame, and the glint of a star-shaped badge caught the last rays of sunlight. "Thomas Dawson, County Sheriff," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Couldn't help but notice your situation. Next train isn't due for 3 days." Eleanor straightened her shoulders, refusing to appear as desperate as she felt. "Eleanor Devereux. I was separated from my belongings when the train departed earlier than scheduled. I had stepped off to purchase refreshments, and—" Her voice faltered. The sheriff nodded, understanding without requiring further explanation. "You've got no place to stay, I reckon." It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. "I'm afraid not." Sheriff Dawson studied her for a long moment, taking in her fine clothes now rumpled from travel, the proud tilt of her chin despite the circumstances, and the unmistakable fear she was trying desperately to hide. "You've got to ride with me," he said simply, gesturing toward a sturdy buckskin horse tethered nearby. "Can't leave a lady stranded. Town's got a decent boarding house where you can stay until arrangements can be made." Eleanor hesitated, years of proper Boston upbringing warning against accepting help from a stranger, even one with a badge. But the encroaching darkness and her complete lack of options made the decision for her. "I'm most grateful, Sheriff," she said, drawing herself up with as much dignity as she could muster. "I assure you I can pay my way once I contact my associates in San Francisco." A hint of a smile crossed his weathered face. "No need for promises, Miss Devereux. Helping folks is part of wearing the badge." He offered his hand to help her onto the horse. "Though I should warn you, Willow Creek isn't exactly San Francisco. We're a mining town trying to become something more respectable." As his strong hands lifted her onto the saddle, Eleanor felt a strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear or hunger. Sheriff Dawson swung up behind her, his chest solid against her back as he reached around to take the reins. The unexpected intimacy of their position made her breath catch. "Hold on," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. As they rode away from the station, Eleanor realized she was beginning a journey far different from the one she had planned. The boarding house run by widow Mabel Jenkins was clean and modest, with faded floral wallpaper and furniture that had seen better days but was polished to a shine. The widow herself was a stout woman with kind eyes who asked few questions when Sheriff Dawson explained Eleanor's situation. "Room at the top of the stairs is free," she said, already moving to fetch fresh linens. "Breakfast at 7 sharp, dinner at 6. No gentleman callers after 8, though I suspect the sheriff here is exception to that rule when he's on official business." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "I assure you, Mrs. Jenkins, there will be no need for exceptions. I plan to be on the first train that comes through." Widow Jenkins exchanged a knowing glance with the sheriff. "Of course, dear. 3 days, then." After ensuring Eleanor was settled, Sheriff Dawson tipped his hat. "I'll check on you tomorrow, Miss Devereux. Town's small enough, but there are some characters it's best to avoid." "Thank you for your kindness, Sheriff," Eleanor said formally, though her eyes conveyed deeper gratitude. Once alone in her room, Eleanor finally allowed herself to break down. Her carefully constructed plan lay in ruins. The teaching position waiting in San Francisco had been her last hope after her father's creditors had taken their family home. Now she had no money, no references, and no clear path forward. Sleep came fitfully, dreams of speeding trains and faceless pursuers interrupting what little rest she managed to find. Morning brought with it the aroma of coffee and fresh bread, coaxing Eleanor from her troubled sleep. She dressed in yesterday's clothes, attempting to smooth the wrinkles as best she could before descending to the dining room. "There she is," Widow Jenkins called cheerfully. "Thought you might sleep through breakfast." Eleanor managed a smile. "I wouldn't dream of missing it. It smells wonderful. Sheriff Dawson asked me to tell you he'd be by around noon," the widow said, placing a plate of eggs and bacon before Eleanor. "Said something about helping you send a telegram." Eleanor's stomach tightened. There was no one to telegraph, no one who would send money to help her. The fiction of associates in San Francisco would soon crumble. At precisely noon, a knock came at the boarding house door. Sheriff Dawson stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking somehow different than he had the previous evening. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he'd exchanged his dusty duster for a clean shirt and vest. "Miss Devereux," he said with a nod. "Thought you might like to see a bit of Willow Creek while we get your telegram sent." Eleanor followed him out into the bright sunlight, squinting against its intensity. "Sheriff, I must confess something. I have no one to telegraph. I was to take up a teaching position in San Francisco, but I have no funds to get there now." Thomas studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes thoughtful rather than judgmental. "Figured as much. Most folks with connections don't end up stranded at train stations." He gestured down the street. "Come along anyway. Town school teacher left 2 months ago to get married. Mayor's been searching for a replacement ever since." Hope sparked in Eleanor's chest. "Are you suggesting?" "Just a conversation," Thomas said with a slight smile. "But Mayor Harrison is a reasonable man, and we need educated folks in Willow Creek almost as badly as we need law." The main street of Willow Creek bustled with more activity than Eleanor had expected. Wagons rolled past, storekeepers swept their boardwalks, and miners fresh from their claims mingled with cattle hands in the saloon. Several people nodded respectfully to the sheriff as they passed, curious eyes lingering on Eleanor. "Town's growing," Thomas explained. "Silver Strike last year brought miners. Miners brought business. Business brought families. Families need schooling. And law," Eleanor added, glancing at his badge. Thomas smiled. "That too. Though some days I wonder if I'm making any difference at all." They stopped before a white clapboard building with Town Hall painted above the door in fresh black letters. Inside, Mayor Harrison proved to be a balding man with an impressive mustache and shrewd eyes that evaluated Eleanor carefully as Thomas explained her situation. "A Boston education, you say?" The mayor mused, tugging at his mustache. "An experience?" Eleanor straightened. "I was a tutor for several prominent families in Boston for 3 years, sir. I can provide a comprehensive education in literature, mathematics, history, and the sciences." Mayor Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "Terms meant to start in 2 weeks. Building's ready, but no teacher. Could be Providence that brought you to our little town, Miss Devereux. Or a train schedule error," Thomas added with a hint of humor. By the end of the meeting, Eleanor had been provisionally engaged as the new schoolteacher of Willow Creek, with a small salary and lodging in the rooms above the schoolhouse once it was properly prepared. Until then, she would remain at the boarding house, with the town covering her expenses. "I don't know how to thank you, Sheriff," Eleanor said as they walked back toward the boarding house, her heart lighter than it had been in months. "Thomas," he corrected gently. "When I'm not wearing the badge officially, I'm just Thomas." "Thomas," she repeated, his name feeling right on her lips. "Then I'm Eleanor." "Eleanor," he echoed, a smile warming his eyes. "Welcome to Willow Creek." Days passed quickly as Eleanor settled into life in the small town. Widow Jenkins helped her acquire a few simple dresses on credit until her first payment came due. Thomas introduced her to the townspeople, many of whom were eager to meet the new schoolteacher and share their expectations for their children's education. Eleanor found herself drawn to Thomas in a way that both excited and frightened her. He was unlike any man she had known in Boston, straightforward, honest, lacking the polished manners of society men, but possessing a natural dignity that commanded respect. Each evening, he would stop by the boarding house to check on her, their conversations growing longer, more personal as they discovered shared interests in books and music. A week after her arrival, Thomas invited Eleanor to join him for a ride outside town. "Thought you might like to see a bit more of the territory you've found yourself in," he explained, helping her mount a gentle mare borrowed from the livery. They rode beyond the town limits, following a winding trail that climbed into the foothills. The landscape took Eleanor's breath away, vast expanses of red rock and scrub brush, punctuated by vibrant wildflowers that somehow thrived in the harsh conditions. "It's beautiful," she breathed, drinking in the untamed scenery. "So different from Boston." Thomas nodded. "Takes some getting used to. When I first came out west, I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. Everything was too big, too open." "What changed your mind?" He smiled, gazing out at the horizon. "Woke up one morning, stepped outside my tent, and watched the sunrise set those red rocks on fire. Felt something shift inside me. Knew I belonged here." "What brought you west in the first place?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious about the man who had so unexpectedly changed the course of her life. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "War," he finally said. "After Appomattox, couldn't go back to Tennessee. Too many ghosts. Headed west like a lot of boys did, looking for something that wasn't tainted by what we'd seen." Eleanor nodded, understanding more about him in that moment than hours of conversation had revealed. "My father lost everything in the Panic of '73, she offered in return. "Banking, investments, our home. His pride. He never recovered." "I'm sorry," Thomas said simply, his eyes meeting hers with genuine compassion. They stopped at a high point overlooking the valley, dismounting to rest the horses. Eleanor found herself standing close to Thomas, their shoulders nearly touching as they gazed at the town below. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for this, but for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been at that station." Thomas turned to face her, his expression serious. "Been thinking about that myself. Wasn't even supposed to be there that day. Had business in the next town over, but got done early." "Providence, as Mayor Harrison suggested?" Eleanor asked with a small smile. "Maybe so," Thomas agreed, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. "Eleanor, The crack of a rifle interrupted whatever Thomas had been about to say. He reacted instantly, pulling Eleanor down behind a large boulder as another shot rang out, sending rock chips flying. "What's happening?" Eleanor gasped, heart pounding with fear. "Ambush," Thomas said grimly, drawing his revolver. "Likely the Callahan boys. Robbed a bank in Tucson last month. Been hiding in these hills." "Are they after you?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Thomas nodded. "Been tracking them. They must have spotted us riding out." He peered carefully around the boulder, then ducked back as another shot kicked up dust nearby. "3 of them, by the looks of it. Down in that gully." "What do we do?" Eleanor asked, surprising herself with her calm. Thomas met her gaze. "I need to draw their fire, get them to waste bullets. When they reload, I'll make a move." Before Eleanor could protest, he was already in motion, darting from their cover to another boulder several yards away. Gunfire followed him, bullets ricocheting off stone. Eleanor watched in horror as Thomas returned fire, his movements precise and controlled despite the danger. One of the outlaws cried out, clutching his arm. Thomas used the distraction to advance further, working his way toward the gully. Minutes stretched like hours as the gunfight continued. Then suddenly, silence fell. Eleanor held her breath, straining to hear any sound that would tell her Thomas was safe. "Eleanor," his voice called finally. "It's clear." She emerged cautiously from behind the boulder to find Thomas standing over 3 men who lay face down on the ground, hands bound behind them with leather straps. "Are they?" she began, unable to finish the question. "Just wounded," Thomas assured her. "Nothing fatal. They'll stand trial proper." He glanced up at the darkening sky. "We need to get back to town. I'll send a couple of men to bring these 3 in." The ride back to Willow Creek was tense and swift, darkness falling around them as they urged their horses down the trail. By the time they reached town, a crowd had gathered, drawn by the sound of gunfire in the hills. "Sheriff got the Callahan boys," someone shouted as they rode in, triggering a spontaneous cheer from the assembled townspeople. Through the commotion, Eleanor could only watch Thomas as he briefly explained the situation to his deputy before turning back to her. Despite the danger they had just faced, she felt strangely alive, aware of every breath, every sensation. I need to get you back to the boarding house, Thomas said, his hand gentle on her elbow as he guided her through the crowd. Widow Jenkins fussed over them both when they arrived, insisting on examining Eleanor for injuries despite her assurances that she was unharmed. Thomas stood by quietly, his eyes rarely leaving Eleanor's face. I should go, he said finally, when Widow Jenkins had retreated to the kitchen to prepare tea. Need to organize a party to bring in the Callahans. Thomas, Eleanor said, catching his hand before he could leave. Be careful. He looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face. Without a word, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a brief, tender kiss. I will, he promised, then was gone, leaving Eleanor standing in the parlor, fingers pressed to her lips, heart racing from more than just their recent danger. The next day brought both excitement and trepidation. The Callahan boys had been successfully brought to the jail, and Thomas was being hailed as a hero throughout town. Eleanor found herself the subject of curious glances and whispered conversations as she made her way to the schoolhouse to continue preparations for the upcoming term. Thomas had not come by the boarding house that morning as had become his custom, and Eleanor tried to ignore the disappointment that settled in her chest. He had responsibilities, after all, especially now with 3 dangerous prisoners in his jail. The schoolhouse was a simple one-room building with large windows that allowed light to stream in across rows of wooden desks. A larger desk for the teacher stood at the front, alongside a blackboard mounted on the wall. Eleanor was arranging books on the shelves when she heard the door open behind her. Working hard, I see, came Thomas's familiar voice. Eleanor turned, unable to hide her smile. I want everything to be perfect for the children. Thomas crossed the room to stand before her, his expression serious. About yesterday. About what happened before all the trouble started. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. You mean when we were interrupted? And after, he added, his eyes searching hers. I shouldn't have. That is, I didn't ask permission. To kiss me. Eleanor finished for him, summoning courage she didn't know she possessed. Perhaps you should remedy that oversight. Thomas's eyes widened slightly, then crinkled at the corners as he smiled. Miss Devereux, might I have permission to kiss you properly? You may, Sheriff Dawson, she whispered. This time, the kiss was unhurried, his hands gently cradling her face as his lips moved against hers with a tenderness that made her knees weak. When they finally parted, both were breathing faster, a new understanding shimmering between them. I've never met anyone like you, Eleanor, Thomas said softly. When I saw you standing alone on that platform, something told me my life was about to change. Eleanor smiled, her hands resting lightly on his chest. I thought my life was ending when that train pulled away. I never imagined it was just beginning. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity as Eleanor began teaching the children of Willow Creek. There were 23 students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age, with widely varying levels of education. Some could barely write their names, while others had been well schooled before their families moved west. Eleanor threw herself into the challenge, developing individual lessons and fostering a sense of community among her diverse students. Thomas continued his duties as sheriff, now with the added responsibility of guarding the Callahan brothers until the circuit judge arrived. Yet he made time each day to see Eleanor, walking her home from the schoolhouse in the afternoons and often staying for dinner at the boarding house under Widow Jenkins's increasingly approving eye. Their courtship progressed with the steady, unhurried pace that seemed to characterize life in the West. Thomas introduced Eleanor to the simple pleasures of frontier living, fishing in the creek that gave the town its name, attending community dances where fiddle music filled the night air, and sharing quiet evenings on the boarding house porch, talking until stars carpeted the vast sky above. Eleanor wrote to the school board in San Francisco, politely declining the position she had originally traveled to accept. Willow Creek had become home in a way Boston never had, its people accepting her without question or judgment. And Thomas had become essential to her happiness in a way she had never thought possible. One evening in late October, as golden leaves drifted from the cottonwoods along the creek, Thomas invited Eleanor for a walk after dinner. They strolled arm in arm through town, nodding to townspeople who greeted them warmly, many now accustomed to seeing the sheriff and schoolteacher together. Circuit Judge finally sent word. Thomas said as they reached the edge of town. "He'll be here next week for the Callahan trial." "That's good news," Eleanor replied, sensing there was more Thomas wanted to say. He guided her to a bench overlooking the creek, the water glinting silver in the moonlight. For several minutes, they sat in comfortable silence, Eleanor's hand clasped warmly in Thomas's larger one. "Been thinking a lot lately," he finally said, his voice low and earnest. "About the future. About what I want." Eleanor's heart quickened. "And what is it you want, Thomas?" He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "You, Eleanor. A life with you. A home, a family." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring, the moonlight catching on a modest diamond set in silver. "This was my mother's. I've been carrying it since the day after you arrived in Willow Creek." Tears sprang to Eleanor's eyes as Thomas slipped from the bench onto one knee before her. "Eleanor Devereux, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? I can't offer you the luxury you might have known in Boston, but I promise to love you and protect you for all my days." "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Thomas, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into his arms, his kiss filled with promise and a future neither could have imagined when fate brought them together at an empty train station. Their wedding took place on a crisp November morning, with the entire town in attendance. Mayor Harrison performed the ceremony in the white steepled church, and Widow Jenkins wept openly as Eleanor walked down the aisle in a simple white dress sewn by the ladies of the town. "I, Thomas, take thee, Eleanor." His deep voice carried clearly through the church, steady and sure as he spoke his vows. "I, Eleanor, take thee, Thomas," she responded, her voice catching with emotion as she promised to love and cherish him for all her days. As they exchanged rings and were pronounced husband and wife, Eleanor thought of the day she had been left behind at the station with no ticket, no hope, and no future. How strange and wonderful that the worst day of her life had led to the best, to Thomas, to Willow Creek, to a happiness she had never thought possible. The celebration continued long into the evening, with dancing and feasting in the town hall. As twilight fell, Thomas led Eleanor to the small house he had purchased at the edge of town, carrying her across the threshold with gentle strength. "Welcome home, Mrs. Dawson," he murmured, setting her carefully on her feet in the cozy parlor furnished with a mix of his bachelor belongings and wedding gifts from the townspeople. "Home," Eleanor repeated, the word filled with meaning as she gazed up at the man who had changed her life with a simple offer of help. "I never thought I'd find one again after leaving Boston." "Sometimes the best things happen when our plans fall apart," Thomas said, drawing her close. "When that train left without you, I found the greatest treasure I could imagine." Eleanor smiled, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. "And when you said, 'You've got to ride with me,' I found a journey beyond anything I could have dreamed." Their lips met in a kiss that sealed their vows more surely than any ceremony could. Two hearts joined by chance, choice, and the kind of love that turns misfortune into blessing. As the first stars appeared in the clear western sky, Eleanor and Thomas Dawson began their life together, proof that sometimes being left behind is simply the first step to finding where you truly belong. In the years that followed, Eleanor would often think back to that moment of despair on the train platform, marveling at how completely her life had transformed. Thomas continued as sheriff while Eleanor taught the growing number of children in Willow Creek. Their own family expanded with the birth of their daughter Sarah in the spring of 1878, followed by twin boys, James and William, 2 years later. Willow Creek prospered and grew, with Thomas eventually hanging up his badge to serve as mayor when Harrison retired. Eleanor's school expanded to 3 rooms with additional teachers, her educational philosophy shaping a generation of Western children who carried both knowledge and compassion into their adult lives. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and they sat together on their porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, Eleanor would take Thomas's hand and whisper, "Thank you for being at that station." And Thomas would always reply, with the same steady love that had carried them through both joy and hardship, "Best ride I ever offered, Mrs. Dawson. Best ride I ever offered."